father is then brought out and also made emperor again, and they co-rule for a very short amount of time. The problem is, especially the issue of submitting the Byzantine Church to the authority of the Pope in Rome. That's not a popular thing, and when Alexius also has to melt down public treasure and icons and things to try to raise money to pay off the Crusaders, this really stirs up lots and lots of resentment against him. And eventually this leads to rioting, and Alexius ends up being killed in the course of all of that and replaced by someone who has a much stronger stance against the Crusaders. And because we haven't seen enough guys named Alexius, the person who replaces the last of the Anglos emperors was also named Alexius. He was from the family Duke. He had a nickname of Mertzupus, which means the gloomy, but it can also be a reference to his eyebrows, which apparently were bushy. Anyway, Alexius was someone who had fought against the Crusaders and during the early stages of the rivalry between Alexius III and the IV, and he had gained some distinction there, and that gave him a lot of credibility with the people. And as soon as he took power, he began to attack the Crusaders. He told them he was not going to honor the agreement that Alexius IV had made, and he was determined to fight it out. He sent for help to the governors of Byzantium, and he manned the walls, and he was ready to roll, at least at first. So at one point he beat off one of the assaults. I think it was on April 9th of 1204, so he, was able to pull that off. But then he decided to flee for his life, and he was nowhere to be found when the second assault came on April 12th. And the Crusaders were breaking into the city, and the situation could have been salvaged had there been a leader there. But the problem is the Varangian Guard decided to go on strike to try to negotiate higher wages. They said, hey, we're saving the situation. We could win the battle right now, but it would cost us a lot of blood, and we're just wondering, is this really worth our time to save you guys when you're broke as hell and you're probably not going to be able to really compensate us? So anyway, the Byzantines then the Varangians, tried to offer their services to the new Latin overlords of Constantinople, and they were refused for the most part. But as this is going on, the Crusaders make their plans, and they come up with a scheme of division, and we'll talk about that next time we revisit Byzantium. But at any rate, for now, just suffice it to know that the Byzantine Empire gets carved up after the Crusaders overrun it in 1204. So now that we've gotten about 120 years or so of narrative history out of the way, let's go back and think about this from an institutional standpoint. This era, what I would call the long 12th century, since it extends from the end of the 11th into the early 13th, is really the story of the rise of the military aristocrats to complete dominance within the state. There had been an old conflict between the military and civil aristocrats in the era before Alexius I, but that era is now over, and the military faction is totally in charge. And if anything, it looks like the aristocrats became more and more militarized to the point that there no longer was a civil aristocracy. And because the Komnenoi were a product of the military aristocracy, there was no ideological daylight between them and their chief aristocrats. Which means that rather than pushing for a stronger state at the expense of the provincial aristocrats, the Komnenoi share the concerns and interests of the provincial military aristocrats. Interestingly enough, one key difference between Byzantium and the West, which makes Byzantium not feudal, is that aristocrats in the East had a strong affiliation with cities, and they also had a part in the life of each city. So, unlike in the West, where one of the key sort of features of feudalism is that you see a conflict between the great landed lords out in the countryside and semi-independent towns who didn't pay tribute to those lords, In the east, no such division exists. So that's something to keep in mind if you're wondering why the Byzantines don't count as feudal. Alexius I is the person who really systematized the protonoia system. Before, it had been kind of just like you get a grant and you're expected to be a soldier vaguely. But now under Alexius, each protonoia grant, based on its value, has a certain set of and this will be really laid out and regulated well under Alexius and his successors. The Great Lords would be people who would receive a large pronoia, and in addition to equipping themselves and showing up for battle, they would also be responsible for equipping others and bringing them along. So there were different levels of pronoia grants. Some were for equipping large numbers of men, others were individual grants. The system had a fair amount of flexibility in that regard. Let's now look at the economy during the long 12th century. We really can't quite figure out if the Venetian trade agreement damaged the Byzantines or to what extent it damaged the Byzantines. The old assumption is that it made Byzantium impoverished, but modern archaeology has revealed that the Byzantine empire was actually fairly prosperous during the 12th century. The state, however, was impoverished, and that is in large part due to the triumph of the military aristocracy, which were provincial landowners who didn't want to pay taxes. But most of the other parts of the empire were doing well. We'll talk about the cities and some other areas that were doing pretty well. We also see plenty of evidence of population growth, increased wealth, and more production and consumption pretty much throughout the empire. So the economy actually did well. However, the emperors of Byzantium did not really seem to gain too much from it. And based on the land policies that were pursued during this period, I'm willing to guess that most of the gains that were made went straight to the